Hello, everybody, and welcome to another video. Today it is the 23rd of October, and today is just going to be a quick general frontline update. And so in Kherson, there was news from the Russian sources that the Ukrainians had withdrawn from the town of Bezhiminya. And so this came as a surprise to me because I was of the belief that this was under Russian control ever since it went back and forth in September, and then Russia eventually recaptured it. But it's possible that Ukraine at some point launched some sort of probing attack and was able to retake it. And so they actually set up trench fortifications here all around the perimeter of the town. And so it was sort of entrenched. But the thing is, basically, all of it was leveled. All the houses are destroyed, probably due to the month's worth of heavy fighting in this area. And so there's really no cover from any sort of airstrikes or from shelling or from drone strikes. And so they were in a very exposed positions, the Ukrainians. And as the Russians, and specifically the 810th Marine Brigade, really rained down heavy artillery fire on the units in this area, they were forced to hide in bushes and in their trenches and stuff like that. And so it is a relatively undefendable position given the circumstances. So it is certainly possible that they withdrew at some point, but that's at least according to the Russian sources. But anyway, let's move on to the front around Milave, where there have been rumors recently of Ukraine being able to make ground over here, take some of the open fields in front of Milave and approaching it. But in terms of exact locations, I don't have any because we haven't really seen any geolocated footage north of it or in the town itself. Really, most of the fighting is still going on around this inlet over here that splits Donetsk in half. So that's really where most of the fighting has been. The Georgian Legion, which is a pretty formidable unit that has been fighting for a while in Ukraine, they mentioned that they were on the way to Milave, and so that could be hinting at something. And again, a lot of Ukrainian sources, they were spreading unconfirmed reports that the Russians were starting to withdraw their forces from this area. But again, there's no confirmation of this. And in fact, there are opposing reports saying that Russia is actually sending more forces into this direction, which I'll talk about in a second. But it seems like for now, the line has remained stable despite attempts by Ukraine to break through or engage at the Russian defensive lines using probing attacks. And so you did actually have some probing attacks reported today from the 17th Tank Brigade. So they're sending in small recon forces, probably around the area of Novokamyanka. That's really what they say, the Novokamyanka direction, around Piatakhti and some of these minor towns over here. This is really where you've seen the most reports of recon operations. There's actually one report about recon operations that were being conducted in this town called Polyanka, which I cannot find on the map. It's somewhere in between Novokamyanka and Dudchani, and in between like Sukhanove. The general location that I saw on the Rybar map was like around over here, but there's no settlements in this area, and so I'm not sure what they're referring to when they say that there's fighting along the Polyanka line. Perhaps Polyanka used to be some settlement over here, but it no longer exists. But anyway, there's also reports of the 46th Air Mobile Brigade trying to infiltrate towards the Russian lines around Ischenka from their new staging point in Davydiv Brid. You do have a lot of new units being sent in as reinforcements are moved into the Davydiv Brid area because it is a good staging ground to push further into the Russian lines. So you have, for instance, the 115th Brigade or the 46th Brigade, which is responsible for this recon operation. Also, this reconnaissance battalion. And so clearly there is some recon operations going on over here as they try to like traverse through the roads, try not to get spotted by the Russian artillery, and then actually infiltrate into these minor towns where you don't really have a permanent Russian garrison sometimes. Sometimes they're being moved in from some larger towns. So they come in and out depending on the shelling. And so it is sort of fluid over here, but they were not able to make any headway in this town just yet. There are also local reports from the Telegram channels in and around Kherson, not really affiliated with any government, just residents over there. They're saying that there's a transfer of Chechens and of military equipment towards Berislav, which is now really the command center for the Russian grouping on the right side of the Dnieper River. And so they're saying that a lot of these troops are being moved over right now, which is sort of contrary to the rumors that Russia would be withdrawing from this bank of the river on this pocket area. It implies that they're still holding on to the area. They don't want to fall back to any sort of secondary or tertiary defensive line. They want to hold out as long as possible. One area where I could see a potential Ukrainian breakthrough is around Sukhanove, because I'm not exactly sure how well fortified it is. You can see how the Ukrainians have had trouble to break through the inlet over here, because basically all of the roads over here were blown up. And so it's not necessarily possible for the Ukrainians to even cross over. And so they're going to try and infiltrate through the direction around Novokamyanka. There have been some heavy clashes reported there in recent days. And you can see there's like this one path that's leading from there towards this town, Sukhanove. There are a few other minor roads that lead towards this town. And once this town would be captured, it would open the gateways to Milave, because they would now have this good position to advance towards the east and actually cut off whatever Russian forces are in Milave or in towns just to the north of it, like in Kachkarivka. And then from there, they can break through the Russian defensive lines even further and push them all the way back to Novokairi. And if they do this by cutting the Russians off guard, that would be even better for the Ukrainians, and it would basically stabilize the front line around this area over here along the road from Novoairsk to the inlet in Novokairi. So that's probably part of Ukraine's future strategy. In the meantime, though, Russia is continuing to fortify Kherson itself. The internet has been down in Kherson for over a day now. It seems as if it was intentional. The Russians want to have a total media blackout in the city to make sure that Ukraine isn't able to get any information as to their plans over here. A lot of supermarkets are actually empty right now. All the shelves are empty, no food, implying that Russia is already evacuating this entire area and evacuating all of the civilian facilities. Also, it shows that there are no more supplies of like civilian aid being moved across the river to Kherson city itself. So again, that shows that the Russians are now in a posture to totally evacuate the civilians. And so that's been going on today. You've had a lot of ferry activity, but interestingly, in recent hours, we haven't seen that much. It was much more commonplace earlier today, but we didn't see that much transportation or rotations of ferries in the past 8 hours or so. Here's actually some satellite imagery of the Russian ferries moving across the river. It's not just one, there were 3 recorded, and it's either because they're evacuating civilians or because they want to transfer additional supplies, or it could be a combination of the two. You're seeing a lot of back and forth with these ferries, so that's all entirely possible. Before I move on, I want to look actually at some of the weather in this area. You can see that over the past few days, there's actually been a lot of fog and low clouds in the area around. You can see Mykolaiv, also Kherson if you zoom in a little bit, all over the front line basically. And let's go back in time to the previous days to see the difference. You can see again, fog, low cloud. Over here, fog, low cloud. It's been like this for a very long time. And so that also puts a dent in any sort of offensive operation. But it could also be an issue for the Russians because it's more difficult for them to conduct airstrikes, for instance, when there's a lot of fog in the area. But let's move on now to the Donetsk front, where there are some changes. here you can see that I adjusted the map based off of a geolocation. And so let's zoom in a little bit. Over here, you had a Ukrainian unit hitting Russian trench positions, which are a bit further north than what I had the map marked as. You can see they probably made some advances over the past few weeks along the ring road. I'm not sure the full extent though, but it could be even further north just based on the fact that they have trench positions over here. And so you can see that there are probably several layers of Ukrainian lines. One is probably based off of this hedgerow over here. There's another one probably based over here. And then one, of course, right on the outskirts of Vodiane itself, not to mention the town Vodiane and all of the fortifications within the town itself. And also the same thing could really apply to Opitny, where there have been some minor advances by the DPR and Russian forces in recent days. But the gains have really been limited to about, let's say, 100, 200 meters. Look, maybe about 500 feet. Not anything that important, but that's just the nature of the warfare over here. It is very static. Any sort of change is notable, to be honest. But still, there's a long way to go before they reach either Vodiane or Pitny, especially given the fact that there are now these aerial reconnaissance units that are moved in. This one aerial reconnaissance unit was used to hit the Russian trench that is linked in this video. And so that is still a formidable force, and it is a problem for any sort of troops that are in trenches. They always have to make sure that they're safe from above, that they're in cover. Also, of course, the situation in Porvobaysk hasn't changed, or in Marinka. There were reports from the AFU General Staff of attacks in these directions, but nothing formulating, of course. But let's move on now to the Bakhmut direction, where I have seen a lot of rumors from the Ukrainian side that actually pushed back the Russians. Specifically, they pushed them out of Patrice Lumumba Street. Over here, I'm going to draw the alleged line of demarcation. Also, the asphalt plant, some sources have said that it was retaken by Ukraine, although there's really no footage to indicate that Ukraine has retaken any land in this area. So I am still skeptical of that until we get any sort of information or elaboration with additional footage. The Ukrainian General Staff, they reported attacks in the direction of Odradivka, Opitny, Ivanhrad, Bakhmut, of course, Soledar, and Kishlivka or Zaryanivka. And so if the Wagner group is still pushing towards these towns, then it's likely that they still control their forward positions around Bakhmut and that they haven't been pushed back. Although it is possible, and I'll say the reason why it is because a lot of reservists have been moved in towards Soledar, Bakhmut, that entire area from towns like Kostiantynivka and Chasiv Yar, which are located over here. You can see Chasiv Yar. A lot of supplies and reinforcements are coming in from this town, and it's also a good area for staging artillery. So you do have units and elements of the 93rd Brigade that are being sent in, also from the 53rd Brigade, 30th Mechanized Brigade. Here's the 53rd. It's holding the line around Opitny. Also 54th Brigade and the 115th Territorial Defense Brigade. Also the 58th Brigade, which is somewhere over here. I need to add it to the map. But all those units, they're really working in tandem. They've had their manpower bolstered in recent days to deal with the Wagner advances, and it is possible that they were able to stop attacks, but in terms of actually pushing them back from certain areas, I just don't know for sure yet. There were some reports that the Wagner group tried advancing towards Klishchivka and that the 53rd Brigade sort of tried to cut them off as they were doing this, and it seems as if nothing really materialized out of that. Wagner hasn't taken Klishchivka yet, and the 53rd Brigade hasn't been able to cut off Wagner yet. But you can see if the Wagner group were to sort of push towards Klishchivka, maybe the units that are stationed around Opitny could go on the counterattack from the south just to pressure their flanks. That's something that could potentially happen. Also, there's a geolocation from just outside of Klishchivka of Wagner group hitting Ukrainian positions. You can see that there's probably a defensive line that is centered around this. I think it's a railroad over here, centered around this railroad. And you have the body of water, first of all, just to the east of it. Also, you have this estate, I would say, a few houses every few hundred meters. And so that could all be utilized to set up a defensive line. You do have like 3 houses over here as well. So again, the fighting is really just isolated to these areas. Also, if there are reports that Ozaryanivka is being attacked, that could potentially be coming from just south of the Bakhmut road, potentially from the newly captured territories in Jovanka, which is over here, a suburb of Zaitsev. And there actually was a video posted of some pillboxes that were taken by the Wagner group, some Ukrainian fortifications. And I'm not sure in which Zaitsev they were found. It could actually be from the southern Zaitsev, not from the northern one, but it doesn't really matter that much. The 93rd Brigade actually hit Wagner Group, so I have that video linked in the same marker, because it was probably from the same general location if the pillboxes were found around this Zaitsev. Anyway, that's it for Bakhmut. Let's move on now to the Luhansk front right now. Here there were probing attacks reported by the Russians in the direction of Raihorodka and some other towns like Kovalivka, which again confirms that those 2 towns and this entire defensive line is still under Russian control. And it really is like the one line before actually reaching the Svatove line. And so it is important for Russia to hold on to this. In recent weeks, we've seen really the lessening of Ukrainian assaults in this direction as they begin to recuperate and prepare for the next operations, because now they're really on sort of an operational pause, because they need to first of all refuel their mechanized units. They need to get their troops rotated and to get new reinforcements trained. All of that takes time, and so there are some issues with the weather as well that need to be dealt with. And so they're just sort of waiting that out until there's some like a good weather conditions for launching a mechanized assault. And so I have made some changes to the map based on a new geolocation of footage outside of Olhivka, which is actually pretty deep into the front line, less deep than many people thought. Based on my map, it's about 6.5 miles away, but there's actually this video of the 95th Ukrainian Brigade actually hitting a BMP column. And so that was just done right over here outside of the town, which would imply that there are actually Russian forces that are much deeper in, about 6 miles in. And that could also put into question whether Makivka is under Ukrainian control or Kharkivka. But we do have actually 2 geolocations from each town respectively. And so it is possible that this video is old, or that it was just a sort of like a fluid attack and that the front line isn't necessarily there. Or maybe it just means that the front line looks more like this. That's certainly possible. But again, it's still some interesting footage, and it does show that the Russians are still very close to the Zherbets River, trying to use it as a defensive line. Although the problem with this is that the Zherbets River isn't actually that wide in certain areas. It is certainly like sufficient for like defenses around here, where it gets pretty wide, and setting up a pontoon bridge does take time, and so it could be struck by the Russian forces. So here it might be a good idea to somehow take control of these towns over here, like Ternian-Polivka or Novosadove. But then a bit to the north, around like Makivka, Nevsky, the river is really, really like, it's really thin, to be honest. And so in some areas, you can just like walk over it. It's certainly possible, and it's not going to stop any sort of Ukrainian infantry or a probing attack. And so in those areas, they need to work on just beefing up their defensive posture or their reinforcements in order to prevent any sort of Ukrainian breakthroughs that reach towards Ploshchanka, because there were actually reports of fighting in the Chervona Popivka area and in Zhitlivka. Again, this all comes from Ukrainian sources, and there's no proof of this yet. But if they were able to break through on this road and reach this general area, then that will put the Russian garrisons in Kremina in big danger, like the bars 13, bars 16 units, because really they'd have only one way to retreat, and that would be towards Rubizhny, and it would also give the Ukrainians an opportunity to break through even deeper into the Russian lines, even get past the defensive fortifications set up around Svatove and this line over here. We could see another one of those like breakthroughs like we saw at Balaklia, and so that's why the Russians really need to reinforce this area if they want to hold on to this line and then potentially advance later on. But anyway, let's go a bit further north where sort of the opposite is happening, where the Ukrainians are now on the defensive posture. And the reason is because the Russians are trying to stabilize the front line around the Oskil River. And so we've heard of assaults in the direction of Dvorichny, in the direction of Hryanikivka. Those towns are still under Ukrainian control to my knowledge, but of course the Russians are trying to assault that area. You also have units from the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade that are sort of doing probing attacks into like Liman Pershi and into all these forests around here, just to like link up with the 14th Brigade in Dvorichny. But for the most part, the Russians do have a presence in this area, and so you actually have some defensive fortifications being set up by not only the 103rd Brigade, but also by the 92nd Brigade and by elements of the 14th Brigade that are stationed around Kupiansk. They're setting up fortifications around these ditches over here in Petropavlivka and in Sinkivka in order to prevent any sort of Russian attempt to get back into the eastern part of Kupiansk, because that is still actually viable if the Russians have the amount of forces necessary. And so that's why they're sort of building up these defenses. But for the meantime, it does seem like the most likely explanation is that the Russians are just trying to stabilize the line before the renewal of major hostilities like we saw a few weeks ago. So that's really it for now. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later.